what are some of the standout figures, notables in town that were kind of not maybe not heroes or villains, but those personalities in town that your family or others would have remembered coming in and out of town?
Oh, I don't think anybody. You mean like famous people coming through this
Famous
area?
people, or
I don't recall anybody ever saying anything about.
Or even just characters that lived here that you might recall that are certain people who did certain trades that aren't done anymore.
My grandmother next door, her brother Bill and Berkels. There's a little blurb in one of Eugene's books about him that I can't remember names. I'm going to have to start marking down names when I remember them. One of the ladies that has passed away now since the in the last couple of years, she was telling how everybody always employed Bill Hoffmeister was a carpenter and cabinet maker, and if you wanted something done right, you called Bill Hoffmeister, but you never gave him any money until the job was done. Mm-hmm. Because if you did, he would go right out and buy a bottle, and then you wouldn't see him for a couple of days. And he made a house in Berkels out of a little barn for himself. And I'm wondering if it's where Jack Sindrick lives now. Although I think Jack said that property is where the Trinity Church was. So I don't know about that.
There is of course, a grand old little house called the Schuster House on the corner of Kruger and Ward Road that sat there for the longest time without anybody living there. But people do remember Mrs. Schuster selling penny candy and things like that out the back of that wall. That was still a collection area for a lot of stuff.
At the time, their house sat lower. The reason a lot of these houses sat lower than the street was way before my father even, but he told how that when they rebuilt Ward Road, they scooped soil up from, even the lot here, the empty lot that I have here, is a little lower than the road. And what they did is they scooped soil up from into the lots and to build the road up higher. And the Schuster House sat down. Now that lot is kind of level with the street, but that sat lower. And when I was a kid, at the corner there, old Mr. and Mrs. Schuster, Bobby's father and mother, and her daughter Heidi that lives in Burke House now, her grandparents, they actually had a stand built along Ward Road. And in the spring, summer, and fall, the land behind, which is just kind of overgrown now, they had huge vegetable garden there. And they would sell that produce there. But they also did have one little part of their stand. They had candy, little candy bars and penny candy and stuff like that. But yes, I remember that as a kid. Yeah.
And that Schuster House was like a farmhouse originally, right? It was its land was probably behind it, and further over, and subdivided in the meantime and sold off like a lot of the other.
Well, houses. I'm sure where Heidi lives now, the brick house next to it, that all that land behind there must have been their land. But I remember them growing stuff right along Kruger Road there in that area that's kind of overgrown now.
Yeah, Bob Clifford, as he was talking about it, he had his arms crossed. He basically said, "Old man Schuster still lives next door in the brick house because he didn't want that thing torn down because his mother had."
Heidi, his daughter.
It was a sentimental thing.
He had something worked out with the town that they could let it stand until he died. And he lived to be pretty old. He was in his high 90s when he died.
It died something of a slow death to me because it had the porch in the front. They took the porch off. They latticed off. try to keep stuff from going underneath the house because it was open. I mean,
it was just like this house, any of the houses. They were all built just on split fields. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I looked at, me and Jim Hoyer were putting up a campaign sign or something on that corner, and I wish I had a better camera or something on me at the time, but I didn't have anything on me. But I did look into one of the windows of that place, and that place looked like it was a haunted house in there because
there were drapes.
There was no drapes.
Curtains that were all ragged.
Yeah, it was literally the haunted house.
The fireman told my father
nothing had been updated there.
Heidi had been stuffing stuff in there like she'd pick up stuff. And they said she had a piano in there that when they went to take it down, that she said, I want to save the piano. And they tried to wheel it over into the garage of the brick house, and it was just literally falling apart. And they said, this is no good. You can't keep this. But apparently she was something of a pack rat.
Wow, it seems that way. Because even the assessment picture taken in the late 50s showed the front porch loaded with various things, including signs from other businesses and whatever else was all inside the front porch of there. And I remember that house going up and down because I went to Buffalo schools, and so forth, special education. So the buses would go up and down through the Tonawondas and so forth. So you saw a lot of these buildings over the years. I'm always kind of curious about where some of these are. And Winston Mahler and his wife were down the way here in another house with a barn yet, but still behind it. I think it's still there.
Who is?
Winston Mahler. He lived down on Ward Road here for a while.
His granddaughter still lives. Oh, I'm thinking of Worth. Maybe that was the Worth house. Maybe that was his grandmother. And they lived with them, I think. Yeah, the house she's redone the house quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
She's our organist here at church.
Oh, that's right, yeah. Of course, everybody remembers the Sawyer Creek restaurant as well as the Creekside and the Misty Night, those places.
See, I don't remember anything about those places.
No,
we never went any place.
I don't mean to say everybody, but
we were very well. We were
out
different.
That way,
We were very poor when I was a kid. We were very poor. We only had this house because, like I say, my grandfather gave him a lot, and the money was loaned from my grandfather's maiden sister around the corner at great grandma's house at the White House. But my father my father didn't even have a 10th grade education. And he did go to school for welding later on, but he never had a job where he made like lots of money or anything. So we literally, I never went to a movie, other than when I was a kid on Good Friday. There was a free showing of a very old film called The King of Kings, and it was the story of the Good Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday. Mm-hmm. And my mother would take us to see that. Back in those days, in the 50s and maybe into the early 60s, everything closed between 3 and 5 on Good Friday. Mm-hmm. But the theater showed this film. But that was the only time I was ever taken to a movie was to see that.
I was going to say, we're kind of down the way from where the Boulevard Drive-In was. I was going to ask you if you ever snuck into that.
The Boulevard Drive-In, I was taken as a kid to see the 10 Commandments because that was all right, because that was a religious movie. Mm-hmm. And then I remember when Exodus came out, my parents, of course, didn't know how to look anything up to see what anything was or anything. And they took us to see Exodus at the Boulevard Drive-In, and they were just so mad because it wasn't a religious movie at all. A lot of these families, everything revolved around the church. There was just nothing else.
Yeah, I was going to ask earlier as to whether or not when North Tonawanda became a city, and Wheatfield, of course, was Wheatfield, and they were one at one point.
North Tonawanda was actually part of Wheatfield, yes.
A lot of it, yeah.
When this pastor came here, he wanted to know about that because he got so confused about this being St. Johnsburg and town of Wheatfield and Niagara County. He came from Denver, I think, and Niagara County. But then we've got North Tonawanda in Niagara County, and then we got across the canal, and you got Tonawanda in Erie County, and he was so confused about what was what. And somebody told, I remember somebody getting up and saying that Wheatfield used to be part of North Tonawanda, I guess. And they also had the dates wrong. And because I wasn't sure, I didn't have it on paper in front of me, I didn't correct them. But what they said was wrong. Well, they ended up buying a house in Tonawanda.
So people, going back that far to the churches were your identifier, not even school district boundaries, not even municipal boundaries.
For the German people, yeah.
Fundamentally, their boundaries were wherever the the various churches had their sees, if you will,
and then of course
their influence.
I always say, if you have a German or French name and you live in the town of Wheatfield or even Niagara County, because a lot of them didn't move out further, that you're probably related. And also, there was some interaction between the churches because you had relatives in the other churches.
And your parents couldn't quite marry right off because they both belonged to two different churches, right? In the other film that we did with the ladies from Germany, when they made their documentary here, they made a fascinating mention, what we wouldn't think would be an issue today, but they belonged to two different churches, and that was a problem.
My parents were my grandparents, and this went on for several years. I didn't really have a very pleasant childhood. Besides the fact that we were very poor, and his dad's parents actually hated my mother. I mean, because it turned out that her grandfather was actually a charter member of St. Matthew's in Tonawanda, which is the same Lutheran church as this Lutheran church. But because they didn't get to pick her out, they had picked Marion Schaefer out. She was Marion Crow at the time. That was who they wanted my father to marry. And so it was quite ugly. This part, that room, the lower room, and the garage wasn't there. And there was just what in the old days they called, there was just a regular door here to the outside. And there was a stoop, which was about this much of a deck, and then steps going down. And if my grandfather he knew my mother was terrified of rats. And if he caught a rat in the barn, he would bring it over and put it there so that when she opened the door, she would just shriek her head off, and it was really ugly.
Oh, boy.
And there was all these. And then to make it worse, the maiden Aunt Hilda that lived in the White House, great grandma's daughter, and my mother's father's half-sister, whose name also was Hilda, worked at Remington Rand. They were part of the Rand girls. Even when they were in their 60s, they were still the Rand girls. And that aunt from the Schumacher side used to tell this aunt that my mother had to be dragged to Sunday school by her hair. It was
Wow.
really awful. Yeah. My mother's family went to the Third Presbyterian on Felton Street, right around the corner in Gratwick there, because, and she said one time she asked her mother, "How come we don't go to St. Mark's Church where Marion's family goes, Marion Crow's family goes?" And my grandmother told her, "Because we don't have the kind of clothes and hats and money to go to that church." And I remember Esther Stang. Years ago, my mother told this story at church here, and Esther happened to be standing behind her. And she turned around and she said to my mother, "And they still do." Because St. Mark's always thought they were a little better than the country churches. But they do consider themselves being a daughter of this congregation. But yeah, that wasn't. I remember my mother's oldest brother was 21 years older than her, and the sister, my Aunt Louise, was 19 years older than my mother. And one time we went down there to visit. Must be just before I was school age, and we went down to visit Aunt Louise and Uncle Art. They had a huge turkey farm down on 104. And they used to live in North Carolina, but then moved down there. And Aunt Louise said, "Why not, we're coming," it was a Friday, and she said, "We're coming to North Carolina tomorrow. Why don't you let Donnie stay with me tonight, and I'll bring him back home in the morning?" My parents said, "Okay, sure, fine." So in the morning, she had to go shopping in Lockport, and my uncle dropped her off, and she was a great seamstress. She'd just sew anything. And in fact, I just found my mother's wedding suit and her going away suit, handmade by my aunt. And anyway, after she got through with her shopping, she said, "We're going to go now. We're going to go to the ice cream parlor." And we went. So we went in, and she said, "I want to get you a sundae. What kind of sundae do you want?" But I had no idea what a sundae was because I had never been taken for ice cream or anything. And when she brought me back that afternoon, she said to my mother, "Does he really not know what a sundae is?" And my mother goes, "Well, no, we don't ever do anything like that. We just didn't have the money."
Right.
And I mean, we always had something to eat, and we always had something to wear, and we always had a roof over our heads, but we didn't have money for anything extra.
And your parents both worked, or did they?
My mother didn't work until she worked a little, cleaning jobs and little things. But when she got married, she worked for G.C. Murphy's. Quit high school. Her and Marion Crowell quit high school in their either late junior year or beginning of senior year to go work at G.C. Murphy's in North Carolina. And so they didn't have a high school education either. And then when she got married, she quit work altogether. And then when the mall opened, what became Bonton?
AM&A's.
AM&A's. When AM&A's opened, she said, "Boy, I'd like to go to work, and I would love to work there." And I said, "Well, I picked out something for her to wear, and I told her, I said, tell them you're interested in antique dishes and that collectible things and things like that," which is why this house is so stuffed full of stuff.
Right.
And gotcha. She went over for her interview, and she came back and she was all excited. She said, I got a job in China and glass." And it turned out that she eventually was their wedding representative for the bridal registry over here. But she said, back at that, when Bonton took over, it really went downhill because they, A&A's, they sold water for her. They sold all the good stuff, all the good china. She used to tell about packing up whole china sets. They would have to pack up because the Canadian women would come over because it was so hard to get anything in Canada, but they'd come over here and buy, and they would buy the expensive china, not just like the Feldskirch that's in the cupboard here. They would buy the expensive china, and my mother and her people she worked with would have to pack it all up and make sure it was packed right so nothing broke in that. But she hated doing it in the house. She loved working outside the house.
And he worked. Where did he work?
My dad?
Yeah.
He worked for Alan Herschel when I was a little boy. And then he said that before he worked at Herschel's, when he was first married, he said if you got laid off at one place like in North Carolina, you just walk down the street and within a half hour or an hour, you'd have another job because there was so much work back after the war. I guess into the 50s. You just were never out of work. So he worked different times. But then he got, like I say, my grandfather, his father, had worked for Alan Herschel for years as a machinist. And so my father started working there, just general work, but then he went and took like a night school courses in welding. So then when they switched to the metal body horses, they would be cast, the body of the horse was one casting, and then the head was another casting, and the legs and tail were another castings, and they would have to all be put together, and he did that for quite a while.
That's the Carousel factory.
The Carousel factory, yeah.
Which is where the Carousel comes from.
He
basically.
worked at, most of the time he worked where the Carousel apartments are now. There was a huge Herschel plant there. That would be before your time. But that's the one where he worked most of the time. That's where I remember they had a big yard where they would set up all the kiddie rides, the small roller coasters and the sky fighters and little whips and the boat rides. And because when Randy gave that talk at the Herschel Museum that one time, he asked, he said, "Would you bring your dad over?" And Dad said, "Yeah, I'll go." And then he was able to identify. In fact, I could tell the one. I said, "That's Grandpa." They had pictures that they didn't know who was in the pictures, but my dad was able to identify several of them from the early 50s. He was able to identify a lot of the people in the pictures for them.
Yeah.
And then he, one day he found out that one of the new hires was making a little more money than he was, and none of them were making a lot of money, or I would have been gone to the movies. And the boss, who I guess was a friend of my grandfather, said, "Oh, you're making more than you're worth now." And my father, just who was not one to do this, just picked up the stuff that was his and said, "Bye, I'm done." And what is now Wentz Service in Sanborn used to be owned by, way back, late 50s, early 60s, was owned by a man by the name of Les Reed, who a lot of people in Sanborn would remember. He owned that business, and my father, I don't know how he started working for him, but he just fell into another job. And then when Les sold out to Beecher Brothers, they said, will Bob come along with it? And then when Wentz bought out, when the two Beecher Brothers wanted to retire, and Wentz bought, that Wentz is connected with our batch of people. It's part of the German bunch. And Wentz said, Kenny Wentz said, his brother, he had several brothers in Sanborn that had all kinds of business in there, but Kenny said to the Beechers, he said, "Well, I want Bob to come along," and my father. And so he just went along with Kenny went and then retired. And then Kenny retired pretty much about the same time, I think.
Anybody associated, you recall, with either the Bel Aerospace complex or the even going further back, the Ward Road Quarry, places like that?
There were a few people
Trichlers
around here that worked at Bell, I think, but nobody in my family that I know of. Like I say, Grandma was shredded wheat, but I don't remember anybody connected with Bell.
Or Trichlers, Trichlers was way up there, but I was able to dig up some information on the Ward Road Quarry, which laid a lot of the foundation work for Ward Road early on, anyways, and that was some fascinating stuff right there. And
Ward Road, I guess, is a very, very old road. I mean, if it was here in 1843, and I think what it was like military road that runs from Taiwan up into Buffalo. I think this was a military road that ran from the south all the way to Sanborn to 104, and ultimately to connect to Fort Niagara and that. But it's a really, really old road.
And there wasn't. It was Randy that said that Nash Road didn't get quite the buildup as it was, because one clue of that is that Fairmont Cemetery never really
there's a story
fully
established
established
about that. They expected that to really develop over there, and now it is, home-wise, but it never developed. It just pretty much stayed farm, I guess.
Yeah, there's a few really good old houses there, but it seems like the mother lode is along Shawnee.
Mm.
A lot of good old houses.
Well,
there.
Shawnee,
And Town Line too.
the little area there that they actually call Shawnee, that predates the German settlement. That there were a few people there and a little store there way back before 1843. But by and large, I guess this whole part of Wheatfield was pretty empty because those couple of old newspaper accounts that are in Eugene's book, the one says how happy they were to get not only settlers but a huge clump of settlers to move in at one time. 800 people at once, and then knowing more were going to come in the next few years, they were really happy to get that development.
What would you say is your hope for the town? If you have any hope for the future, what do you think the future of people remembering this stuff will go? You think it'll be more digital, of course, and therefore more accessible? Do you see more people my age getting involved?
I'm hoping so. I'm hoping, like now Danielle Devontier, she it would be nice if she would stay in this area and keep working with the museum. And then we'd at least have you and her. But it would really be nice if we could get some of the people that are like 20 years younger than me, or even 30 years younger than me, to come into the organization, especially if they had the interest because they were descendants. And who knows, maybe that will happen. I don't know.
Well, it's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. I shall return, I think, because it's just, it's just wonderful.
I'll keep digging for pictures.
Yeah.
And stuff. Yeah. And like I say, if I don't have this heart, they're going to do another, if I don't have to call the doctor before August, sometime in August, they're going to do another echogram. I'm hoping that they got a wrong reading, but she was really, he said this is so serious that if I had to have like another surgery,